Hello, this is Julie Fitzgerald from Guide K-12. Thank you for downloading our referendum planning webinar series. This is the second in a four-part collection. This series, or this particular webinar, is on survey methodology. Excuse me. Don, I'm going to start over.
I thought you might.
Hello, this is Julie Fitzgerald with Guide K-12. Thank you for downloading our referendum planning webinar series. This is the second in a four-part collection. Today's topic is survey methodology. We are fortunate to be joined by Dr. Don Lifto, who will be our presenter for today. Don has been a superintendent for over 25 years. And after he retired as a superintendent, he has been in school finance and working with school districts across the country, helping them with their referenda. He has literally written the book on school referendum and has just completed his third edition of that book, School Tax Elections and Planning for Success in the New Normal, which will be available in June. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Lifto.
Good afternoon, everybody. Happy to be here. This is the second in a four-part series on referendum planning, as Julie indicated. The first one, if you haven't already seen it, has to do with voter files and target structures. And when we move to survey methodology, one of the things we're doing is using voter file information that's been collected and analyzed, and then using it to do a feasibility survey for a future referendum. Many school districts do surveys periodically, and not all of them are related specifically to testing for feasibility. Some of the common reasons that we end up doing surveys for school districts also include surveying parents who are moving into the district or leaving the district under open enrollment, and testing general attitudes in terms of how happy people are with the district, what kind of grades they would give the district, probing information about how people get their information and how they want to get their information. So lots of possible ways to use this particular tool in addition to testing for feasibility. And we'll go through some more specific examples of how school districts use survey methodology to measure the probability of being successful for a future referendum. I mentioned satisfaction testing. Some of my bravest clients, the superintendent actually asks folks to give her or him a grade, A, B, C, D, F. You can see here that the Wizard of Id is excited that his numbers are up in the polls, later finding out that his lousy had actually gone from 80 to 90%. So if you're going to be brave enough to collect that kind of qualitative data, it's pretty important to be ready for whatever you might hear from the community. One additional reason folks sometimes do this kind of work relates to guiding their planning for their strategic goals or their roadmap. And I have an example in this slide deck of how one district did that to help them make decisions about what to invest in. You can also test for key messages and language, and I've got a couple of good examples of that as well. To begin with, just a quick primer on some of the types of surveys that can be done. So as a consumer, you can be smart about what methodology to use based on what your needs might be. The simplest and the least expensive option is a census survey. If we have 100 people on the line today watching this particular webinar, if we sent out a hot link to vote on whether you thought it was boring, average, or stimulating, and all 100 of you voted, that would be an example of a census survey. So it's in those situations where you're able to collect information from everybody in the population. The advantage, of course, is there's no sampling error. The problem is that unless it's a really small population, it's almost impossible to use on a larger scale. With the continued expansion of survey options on the internet, more districts are using opt-in surveys. An opt-in survey, as the name implies, is people are choosing whether to go to your website or respond to a paper survey that was mailed to them. They're choosing to do it, which would be opting in, or they're choosing to ignore it. One of the advantages of an opt-in survey is it's a good engagement tool. More and more of our clients are using an opt-in internet-based survey after we've completed a scientific random sample survey, using the scientific survey for decision-making and the opt-in survey to provide more people in the community an opportunity to give their 2 cents worth about whatever the issue is. So it's a nice engagement strategy and a good way to get more people involved. The disadvantages relate partially to selection bias. I recently completed an opt-in survey for a large suburb in Kansas, and when we looked at the results, there were twice as many women who took the survey as men, and well over half of the people who took the survey were parents of school-aged children. So you have to be careful about not making important decisions based on opt-in survey data when the demographics are not controlled or accounted for in the information that you're receiving. Random sample surveys are primarily what we do. As I said, sometimes followed with an online opt-in survey after all of the phone interviews are completed. And there's a short audio clip here that will just give you a little bit of perspective about what random sample means.
I thought it would be worth spending a little time today talking about polls, not only what the top line numbers show, but how to read them and how much to trust them. I'm joined by 2 of our political reporters, Brian Baxt and Brianna Biersbach, and a special guest, Craig Helmstetter. He leads the APM Research Lab and helped analyze the results of that NPR News Star Tribune poll. Thanks all for being here.
Thanks, Mike.
Craig, let me start with you. Some basic questions about polling. A lot of people are asking after the election 2 years ago, can you trust the polls?
The simple answer, yes.
And why?
The more complicated answer, you can't trust them all, but you can trust them. And I think one thing that really throws people is this basic concept of sampling. And if you don't believe in sampling, well, then you don't believe in math, and good luck with that.
Okay, so sampling, that means, and this is a question I get all the time, our NPR News Star Tribune poll talked to 800 likely voters.
Mm-hmm.
And then from those 800 voters, you extrapolate to the whole population of likely voters. Is that what you mean by sampling?
Exactly, right. So, if you don't believe in sampling, I think, the next time your significant other is making up a batch of soup and hands you a spoon and says, is this soup any good? You have to say, no, honey, that's just a sample of the soup. I need to drink the entire pot to find out what it tastes like. So, similarly here with a small group of people, a seemingly small group of people, 800, we can actually come to pretty firm conclusions about what all Minnesotans think.
And I think it's important that people look at these polls as kind of place in time check-ins. Here's where the race is right now. They shouldn't use them as predictors. Here's where the race will end up 8 weeks from now or 7 weeks from now. They need to look at this, there's still plenty of room for movement, even among the people who say they're supporting candidate X, Y, or Z. They could change their mind. They could vote for somebody else, the opposite person. They could not vote. So keep in mind that these polls have somewhat limited prediction value.
Mm-hmm. And that's what they always say about polls, right? They're just a snapshot in time.
So that clip talks a little bit about the notion of sampling, and the 3 probably most common methodologies that are used for school districts when phone surveys are done, and you're choosing folks randomly for those interviews, are listed on the screen: simple, stratified, and quota. With a simple random sample survey, if your district were to contract with a vendor for 400 random sample interviews, for example, that vendor might use the registered voter database, and the computer then would randomly pick 400 people to be interviewed and complete that interview. Obviously, you have to talk to more than, or call more than 400 people to get 400 completed interviews. But the point is that anyone who would be called for that particular study would be done on a random basis, but there's no demographic controls. We're not trying to pay attention to, are we talking to too many women? Are we talking to too many people over 65? Those random calls, that rapid digit dialing is just cranking away until you're hitting your 400. The stratified and quota both have a characteristic that's different in that you identify targets within the population that you're trying to reach. For example, if you know that 55% of your registered voters are women, you're trying to get 55% of your completed interviews with women. If you know that 20% of your registered voters are 18 to 24, you're trying to get 20% of your completed interviews with that age group. The stratified and quota both have that characteristic. The difference between the two is with the stratified, even though you have quotas based on different demographic groups, just because you have the quotas, you don't stop. So if you were trying to get 55% of your interviews with women and you hit that 55, you keep on calling and you're probably going to get more women. With the quota, you turn off women in this particular example when you hit the quota that you want. So every random sample survey is not the same, and you need to be somewhat knowledgeable about what you're getting from that vendor, matched up with what your needs are. I would say that 90% of the work that I've done over the years with school districts and feasibility surveys, we have had demographic targets. And with those targets, we're essentially trying to have the characteristics of the sample that is interviewed be as closely matched to the demographics of the community as a whole as possible, essentially having your group of folks interviewed mirroring the demographics of the whole. Here's an example of what that might look like. What you're seeing here is parents and non-parents, and you're seeing target in the blue and surveyed in the orange. So what that means is that in this particular school district, somewhere around 18% of registered voters were parents, and conversely about 82% were non-parents. And then what you're seeing in the orange is who was interviewed. And as you can see, even though perhaps 300 or 350 or 400 interviews were completed, that the proportion of parents and non-parents of the interviewees matched the demographics of the whole very, very well in this particular example. The surveys we do also try to control for age, gender, location within the district. This could be a town, it could be a census block, a zip code. Past voting frequency relates to how frequently people have gotten to the polls in the past, and we look at the last 9 elections. And if we have significant diversity within a district, we can look at ethnicity as well when we set up those targets. We don't control for cell phone versus landline when we do phone surveys, but if I've done 300 presentations to school boards on survey results, probably 298 times I was asked, how can you do this work with cell phones? And the answer is we use cell phones. And Most of our studies in recent years have been roughly a 50-50 mix between cell phones and landlines. So if we're going to do a random sample survey, and as I said, we most oftentimes use the Quota survey where we have some targets. We start by taking a registered voter database and looking at the counts that we have within the district. We want to know how many men and how many women and how many 18 to 24-year-olds and how many are over 65, how many always vote, how many never vote, etc. Once we know the profile of the school district as a whole, then we can provide the call center with some targets. We want you to try to get 20% of your interviews with 18 to 24-year-olds, for example. We conduct the surveys by telephone, as indicated here. The average questionnaire is about 35 probes, or 10 to 12 minutes on the phone. This is an important characteristic of a survey to know, again, when you're working with a vendor and finding out what that vendor is recommending to you. There's a good deal of political science survey research that would suggest if you're on the phone more than 15 minutes, the quality of your data is going to deteriorate in two ways. One, you'll have more people halfway through the survey saying, I'm sorry, I don't have time to finish this, and they abort the interview. And the other problem that isn't quite so obvious with a longer time on the phone is the quality of the responses tends to get lower. So at some point, I've been on the phone 15, 16 minutes, I'm getting anxious, maybe there's food in the oven, maybe there's children underfoot, and you're asking me what I think about the new soccer stadium at the high school, and I'm saying, sounds fine. I'm just quickly responding and waiting for the next question, hoping to get off the phone sooner rather than later. So somewhere around that 12-minute, 15 is okay too. That typically results in a questionnaire of somewhere around 35 questions. Now, in that audio clip that you listened to, they were using an example of 800 random calls for a particular study that was being done. Oftentimes, people are surprised to learn that if you heard news coverage of a survey on CNN or PBS News or Fox News or whatever your media outlet might be, they are typically talking about a population of perhaps as much as 300 million registered voters. And for 300 million registered voters, the average sample size is 1,500. So just think about that. 1,500 completed interviews to 300 million as compared to 300 or 400 interviews in your district. So you can get very good, accurate data in that range at the top of the slide, 200, 400. With our larger clients, we typically might go to 500 or 600. And the error of measurement or margin of error is listed. Typically, it's ranging somewhere from 4 to 6%, plus or minus. So we have this merged database, and the merged database is a combination of data from, we use L2 data. That provides us with an electronic list of all registered voters living within the district, but it also provides a lot of other demographic information that's of interest to us, which are listed on this slide. The value of getting the additional demographic information is that when the interviews are completed, we can go back at a particular interview and say, was there any difference between people who responded to our feasibility survey based on whether they had less than high school, college, or advanced degrees? How did the data change based on household income? And so any demographic characteristic that's embedded within the database you're drawing the sample from, you can sort your data from your survey and look at those demographic characteristics to see where the differences are. Customer satisfaction is something that we typically test in all of our surveys, even if it's done primarily for testing for referendum feasibility. We use the Phi Delta Kappa poll. Many educators are familiar with that study that's been done, I think, more than 50 years now. And one of the questions in that particular study asks folks if they were the teacher for the day and were able to give a grade to their public schools, what grade would you give, A, B, C, D, or F? And so here's what a printout from a report might look like from a district in terms of what percentage gave them an A, what percentage gave them a B, et cetera, around that circle graph. What's nice about using the Phi Delta Kappa question is then you can compare the results locally to the results from the national poll, because the national poll is an apples to apples exact same question. In the national poll, people are not grading the nation's public schools, they're grading their own local district where they live. And so here you're seeing an example of a district that did this study in 2016, that's the dark green, and now we're comparing in the light green to how people responded in the national poll. Following up that open-ended question of what are you going to give your local district, an A, B, C, D, or F, we oftentimes will say, what's the primary reason that you gave the district the grade you did? And then we can see a breakout that might look something like this. Here we're testing the level of not support, but the level of satisfaction with how the district has managed its finances in the past. This is often a telling statistic. I had an example of a district recently that somewhere around 60% were giving the district fair or poor in financial management, and that's not the kind of foundation from which you could expect to be launching a successful referendum asking for even more money to manage. I mentioned earlier that some districts use this methodology to help them with their strategic planning or roadmap. Here down the left-hand column, you're seeing questions from the survey, and the folks who were being interviewed were asked if they thought the district should spend more, spend less, or stay about the same. And as you can see in the spend more category, there's quite a great deal of variation from almost 57% down to 36% in this particular case. The school board, of course, is still free to make its decision on how to develop that budget and how to prioritize spending, but at least we're looking at data to help drive that decision moving forward. This is continuing with the chart of the same type of information. Now we're getting down to athletics and custodial services, and as you can see, the support is waning quite a bit in terms of the percentage of people who said we need to spend more on those activities. You can also use the survey to find out how well informed people are about the district, where they get their information. I presented to a Kansas school district this week, and they had something in the neighborhood of 50% saying the primary source of information was from the district's newsletter, which is exactly what you would hope to be seeing if you're writing the district newsletter and they're saying that's my most important source. So this varies a lot from district to district, depending on the characteristics of the district and also whether they have a local paper. Sometimes school districts will be working through a building plan and they're trying to decide if we're going to build a new middle school or are we going to convert the middle school and build a new elementary instead. And again, here, support for building a new middle school and converting an elementary building was almost twice as much preferred as the next alternative. Again, the school board is still free to make its own decision, but at least we're being influenced by the data. I mentioned that sometimes we do these studies specifically focused on open enrollment, particularly for school districts who have very, very high negative ratios of families leaving the district to go to another public school as compared to those coming in from somewhere else. So here we're measuring how much influence different characteristics had in terms of why I've moved my child in or out of the district under open enrollment. When we get to word choices, this can be very, very helpful for people planning the informational materials, PowerPoints, web content, or public meetings, how we want to talk about our project. This example is from a school district that was considering asking for $100 million to upgrade all of the district's libraries. As I was working with the district in this pre-survey process, they kept talking about media centers and media centers. And at some point, I somewhat tongue-in-cheek said, what's a media center? Is that where you go watch a movie, or what is that? Well, as you know, they were talking about their libraries. And so we had a little talk at that point about the barbershop language. And barbershop language is if you go in an old-fashioned barbershop and you've got some older men in there getting taken care of, if you say you want to fix up the libraries, they know what you're talking about. If you say you want to fix up the media centers, they may think they're watching movies. So you see over on the left, there's a 15A and a 15B. This is an example of using a split sample methodology. What it means is that half of the people who were interviewed on a random basis only heard the A question. The other half of the people only heard the B question. And then we can look at the data and say, did it matter whether we said media center or library? And as you can see, there's a huge difference in support levels at 69.9% support when we talked about libraries as compared to 51.8 when we talked about media centers. If you have the unfortunate situation of having an election that failed recently, some districts will use a scientific random sample survey to find out why did it fail and what do we need to do differently to get a better outcome. One of the probes we've used quite a bit is the one you're seeing on this screen, where we read a statement to the person being interviewed and ask them whether they agree with it or not. Our community needs to invest more in local public schools if we want all students to excel. Well, not surprisingly, a very, very high percentage of people agreed with that statement. 76%. That would not surprise anybody. And so you might wonder, what's the value in even asking that to begin with? And one of the things that we can do in that regard that can be helpful for a school district is using software to peel the onion back on that response. So we know that 3 out of 4 people agreed that we need to spend money on public schools if all students are going to be to excel. What the additional analytical work can show you is it looks at how different demographic groups responded. And you can get a report back that would tell you that women between 40 and 60 years old who have 1 or more children in the public schools and live in Delwood have the strongest level of agreement with that statement. and men who were between 55 and 65, who lived in New Hope, who didn't have kids in school, had the lowest level of agreement. So that's an example of using sophisticated analytical software to peel the onion back a little bit on this statement to help you a little bit more precisely with your planning moving forward. Oftentimes we include open-ended questions in surveys. A couple of the most common ones are listed on the bottom of this slide. Tell me briefly what you believe is the best thing about the school district, or conversely, what's one thing that you think really needs to be changed or improved. And when we do those types of probes, we end up with printouts that look something like this. And so the software we use to analyze those open-ended questions are looking to see how frequently certain words were used. So you can see youth programs was a big deal in this particular survey. It was coming up from multiple people in terms of what they most valued, most liked. And then we can also look at other characteristics of those open-ended responses. And with this particular analytic approach using WordStat software, the size of the circle represents how many times that was mentioned by the 400 people who responded to the survey. So the bigger the survey, or the bigger the bubble, the more often it was mentioned, either as a positive or as a negative, depending on the question. Where you see circles close to each other with lines between them, what that means is people who talked about youth programs also talked about sports. So both of those words were in their answers as you look at the bottom left of this particular slide. So what about if you think you need a referendum for more operating money? Maybe you need money for technology or permission to issue debt for a building program. We use what's called a 3-benchmark test. And in the 3-benchmark test, very early in the phone interview, people hear a general statement similar to the one that you probably have been reading as I've talked. The district depends on a voter-approved tax levy for part of its funding. We've had to cut our budget by $10 million. We've increased class sizes. We need more money. What do you think about it? If we brought something forward in the fall for more money, are you going to support it or oppose it? And so this is the initial response to that uninformed benchmark. Now, why do we call it uninformed? Because all they know is what they heard in this short little paragraph. They don't know exactly what's going to happen. They don't know exactly how you're going to use the money if you get more. They don't know all the negative consequences or the positive consequences. So it's an initial uninformed response to that general probe. To start off at 61.5 with just that general statement is actually pretty good, considering that there's not much detail. After going through that initial uninformed benchmark, we provide more information about this particular proposal, content, detail, rationale. And for each statement then, the person is asked if you knew that some of the money was going to be used for this or that, or if you knew this was going to happen, does that make you more or less likely to be supportive? And so here are just some examples of what that might look like. When people heard that without additional funding, that some of the special education programs are going to be cut, that resulted in about 72% of the people saying, if I knew that, I would be more likely to be supportive of additional funding. And the other three on this slide are similar. And as we continue on this slide, we're seeing the same types of questions. If I knew that we needed more money, otherwise we were going to have to cut programs for kids struggling with basic skills, now we're up to about 73% being supportive of that. By the time we get down to talking about cutting bus routes or making walking distances longer, there was much less support for that. So we're testing components of the potential operating referendum in this particular case, and we're measuring how much support we have for different elements. After going through those, we come back with what we call the informed benchmark. Now that you've gotten more information about this proposal, tell me again, what do you think? And here you can see that it went from 61% to 67%, which was a decent increase in the right direction. I should have mentioned in those previous slides when we were testing different elements of the potential referendum that those are done in random order. And we do that to avoid having the same probe, the last thing people hear, for instance. We think that provides more accurate data. Then we can look and say, okay, after people got information, what was the level of support? Well, for parents, it was 79%. For non-parents, it was about 63%. What about male versus female? What about age and the level of support based on age? What about based on where people live? Northern part of the district versus the southern part of the district. How about based on past voting frequency? In this example, we look at the last 9 elections that were held within the district, not school elections only, but all elections, general elections, dog catchers, school board, presidential, even your non-presidential. We look at the last 9 and say, how many times did you vote? And the frequent voters get there pretty much all the time, at least 6 out of 9. The infrequent voters are typically 0 to 3 out of 9. The third benchmark is now we're finally getting to taxes. So if our proposal is going to result in a property tax increase to residents, how are people reacting to the range of costs that we want to test? In this particular district, as you can see, they wanted to test $154, $216, and $278 on an average priced home. In this particular community, the average priced home was $190,000. We used a split sample on this particular probe, so half of the people interviewed heard taxes going up in the numbers that you see on an average priced home, period. The other half heard the same tax impacts on an average priced home of $190,000. So half of the group heard the $190,000, half of the group did not. So we're looking to see, does it matter whether people hear that number or not? And in this particular example, it did matter. So in the light green line, you're seeing the level of support at $154, $216, and $278 tax impact on an average home when they didn't hear how much an average home was. And in the darker green, you're seeing a level of support on an average priced home of $190,000. So this certainly was helpful for the district to understand that when we talk about average, we need to tell people what that average is. And based on the survey data, at least that should result in a little better support, at least at the mid and upper ranges of what were tested for tax impact. Because we have pulled our random sample from a database that includes information about past voting behavior, we can sort things out a different way and basically say, what did people say who pretty much always vote? That's the lightest blue line. What do people say who get there about half the time? That's the other line that appears to be almost on top of the other one. But what do people say who pretty much never vote? And unfortunately, in this particular case, that's the top line. And it's not uncommon to have wildly higher levels of support from people based on their past history at least, who are least likely to get in the door. Certainly that information is helpful for the district in planning and get out the vote efforts to know what type of voter we're talking about that's on our list as someone who has indicated support. Ultimately, this 3-benchmark test that I've been talking about is trying to get a balance. And on the left, we're talking about the purpose of the election and the cost from the district's point of view. And on the right, we're talking about community priorities and what they're willing to pay. And when we can get those two things aligned in balance, everything else being equal, we've got a much better chance of being successful. When I was in Kansas this week giving a presentation of survey results, one of the questions, not surprisingly, was, well, are these things really accurate? It's a little bit like the question that was raised in the audio clip early in this presentation. And this here is just showing the last 14 surveys that we did within a particular time range. And what you're looking at in orange is what the survey predicted the support would be on a percentage basis. And in the blue dots, you're seeing what the actual level of support was. And as you can see, at least among this particular group of districts, that 89% of them won. And about 2/3 fell within the range predicted by the survey's margin of error. So over time, the methodology we use, that 3-benchmark methodology, has proven to be pretty good, not perfect, but 100% better than guessing. When I'm in a group live, of course, one of the questions I get is, what does it cost to do something like this? And it really depends on what kind of survey you're doing. We talked about a census survey, we talked about opt-in, we talked about random sample surveys. How you're going to collect your data, is it going to be a phone survey, it's going to be online. The size of the sample, for our phone surveys, almost all of them range between 200 completed interviews and 600. How long are we on the phone? And the sophistication and cost of the data analysis that we're going to do before and after the survey. Certainly, anyone who wants more specific information about cost can contact Julie or me for that information. In terms of how long does it take, we typically tell folks that 8 to 10 weeks from the time that you launch the project until we've designed the questionnaire, collected the data, and we're working on our reports. In terms of timing related to when to do a survey, if you're going to do only one survey, typically we're looking at somewhere between 4 to 6 months before the school board makes a decision. If you're going to do 2 surveys, a lot of our school district clients will do one 12 to 15 months ahead of time. They'll get their data, and then they'll crank up their communication, education, and engagement strategies for 8, 9 months, and then they'll go back and do a very short tracking survey, typically 4 to 6 weeks before the school board is going to make a final decision, typically to test a couple things that they've been working on. Maybe they didn't get very good support initially for redesigning elementary entrances to improve safety, so they've been working on that for the last 8 months in terms of education and engagement. Now they want to retest it before pulling the trigger, and pretty much always they'll also retest that tax climate to make sure that economic things at the local, state, or national level haven't moved the bar in terms of what people are willing to pay. Additional options for districts include a post-election analysis. This would be a demographic study after an election has already taken place. Maybe it happened a year or 2 ago. You want to know who showed up and who didn't show up by demography, preparation of a voter file and target structure. This would be done post-survey. So now we have our database built, we have our survey done, we know the results of the survey. So who do we think should be in target A? Target A being the most likely people to vote yes, and the most likely people to get to the door to actually vote, as compared to target F, which might be our worst group. And then I mentioned that more and more of our clients, after the random sample phone survey is done, are also then posting the survey on their website and giving a broader group within the community an opportunity to engage. The caution on that is use the scientific random sample survey primarily for decision making. Use the online opt-in survey for engagement, but be a little bit careful not to use the opt-in option for making important decisions. In terms of summarizing what I've gone through, there can be many reasons to conduct a community survey. We talked about all of them mentioned on that top bullet. Best practice seeks to match the methodology with the needs of the district. If you're primarily looking for engagement and getting lots of people responding, but not needing to use the data for important decisions, you might do a less expensive opt-in non-probability survey. If you want to decide whether to invest $100 million in your libraries, and you want to find out if people think that that's a good idea, and if they're willing to pay the taxes associated with that, you're better off with the scientific random sample survey. For more information about what I went through today, you can talk to Julie at Guide K-12 or contact me at the phone number and email here. As I mentioned, this is the second in a series of 4 webinars. I hope you found the information helpful. I'd be happy to help you in the future if your needs include a referendum and you want some assistance. Thank you.